She thought she could humiliate an old servant without consequences, but she had no idea what was coming. What happened next left everyone speechless. Watch till the end to see the shocking twist. Subscribe for more stories and share your thoughts in the comments. The iron gates of the Deo estate stood tall and formidable, a silent testament to the power and legacy that had endured for generations. As the sleek black car rolled up the long gravel driveway, Nicholas Deo leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. The sight of his childhood home stirred something deep within him, a mix of nostalgia, reverence, and an undeniable weight of responsibility. It had been years since he last set foot here, years spent building his empire, making a name for himself far beyond the boundaries of his family's vast estate. And now he was returning, not just as a man of success, but as a husband, and not just with a wife, but with a stepdaughter. Beside him, Isabel, his wife, sat poised, her manicured fingers idly tracing the leather interior of the car. She exuded elegance, a woman of refined tastes and high expectations. Marrying into one of the wealthiest families in the country had been thrilling for her, the idea of luxury and prestige aligning with her desires. But as the estate came into view, her lips pressed into a slight frown. It was grand, certainly, but to her it felt outdated. She had envisioned something more modern, something that matched the opulence she had planned for herself. Nicholas noticed the subtle shift in her expression but said nothing. He had long learned to let her opinions remain unchallenged when it came to matters of aesthetics. Isabel was a woman who knew exactly what she wanted, and more often than not, she got it. But this house, it was more than just property to him. It was a place of history, of memories, of family. In the back seat, Lily, Isabel's daughter from her previous marriage, tapped impatiently on her phone, barely glancing up at the estate. She was 9 years old, spoiled, and used to getting her way. Nicholas had made efforts to bond with her, to be the father figure she lacked, but she remained distant, always retreating into her world of expensive toys and privileged whims. When she finally did look out the window, her nose wrinkled. "This is it," she said, her voice laced with unimpressed disdain. "It looks like something out of a really boring history book." Isabel sighed, resting a hand on her daughter's knee. Now, sweetheart, it's a historical home. Your stepfather grew up here." Lily rolled her eyes and went back to her screen. Nicholas clenched his jaw but let it slide. There would be time for her to understand what this place meant to him. As the car came to a slow halt before the grand entrance, the estate staff had already assembled in perfect formation, waiting to receive their returning master. Nicholas stepped out first, smoothing his jacket before turning to offer his hand to Isabel. She accepted it gracefully, stepping out with the practiced ease of someone who had attended 1,000 galas and high society events. The moment her heels clicked against the stone pavement, her gaze swept across the gathered servants, lingering on them with an expression of detached curiosity. Then Nicholas saw her. Mabel. She stood slightly apart from the other staff, her dark skin lined with the passage of time, but her presence unchanged. She had always carried herself with quiet dignity, her uniform as impeccable as ever, her hands clasped before her. She had been more than a servant. She had been the woman who raised him, who had been there when his own mother had been absent, who had wiped away his tears, scolded him when necessary, and loved him in a way no one else ever had. His chest tightened, and before he could stop himself, he took a step forward. Mabel. Her face lit up, a knowing, affectionate smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "My boy," she said, her voice steady but full of warmth. "You're home." Without hesitation, Nicholas closed the distance between them and wrapped his arms around her. She smelled of lavender and familiarity, of comfort and childhood memories. She patted his back lightly, the same way she had when he was a boy seeking comfort after a scraped knee or a bad dream. Isabel watched the exchange, something close to surprise flickering in her eyes. She had never seen Nicholas embrace anyone so openly, not even his own family members. He was a man of measured gestures, calculated interactions, but here, with this old black woman, he seemed entirely unguarded. When they finally pulled apart, Mabel took a small step back, studying him. "You've grown into a fine man," she said. Nicholas chuckled. "I hope so, though I imagine you'd still scold me if I deserved it." "I would," she admitted with a twinkle in her eye. Marion, Nicholas's aunt, watched the exchange with quiet approval, but James, his older brother, flicked his gaze toward Isabel. He saw the barely concealed confusion on her face, the way her lips pressed together just a little too tightly. He smirked slightly, as if already sensing trouble brewing. Nicholas turned back to Isabel, his hand lightly resting on the small of her back. "Mabel, this is my wife, Isabel." Mabel nodded politely. "Welcome, ma'am." Isabel hesitated for the briefest of moments before offering a small, practiced smile. "Thank you. It's lovely to meet you." The handshake that followed was brief, but something about it made Mabel's expression shift ever so slightly. Isabel's grip was cool and fleeting, her gaze detached. Then, just as quickly as the moment had come, it passed. James leaned in slightly toward Nicholas, just enough for only him to hear. "Well, that was an interesting introduction." Nicholas gave him a sharp look, but James only grinned knowingly. As they moved into the house, Isabel let her gaze wander across the interior. The estate was undeniably grand, but there was an old-world charm to it that didn't align with her vision of luxury. The high ceilings, the dark wooden furniture, the elaborate tapestries. It felt more like a museum than a home. Lily, trailing behind, made a face. "It smells weird in here," she muttered under her breath. Nicholas, however, felt something entirely different. This was home. This was where he had grown up. Every room held a memory, every hallway a whisper of his past, and at the center of so many of those memories stood Mabel. As the doors closed behind them, Isabel let out a slow breath, her gaze flickering toward Nicholas before settling briefly on Mabel. She didn't say a word, but in that moment, something unspoken passed through her eyes. It was the beginning of something Nicholas couldn't yet see. But Mabel saw it. And soon Nicholas would too. The morning light streamed through the grand windows of the Dio estate, casting a golden hue over the polished floors. The house was alive with quiet activity, servants moving about their duties, the clinking of silverware from the breakfast room, the faint hum of life returning to the estate. Nicholas had woken early, adjusting to the familiar yet distant comfort of his childhood home. Isabel, on the other hand, remained in bed longer than usual, clearly unaccustomed to the slower rhythm of estate life. Lily, however, was already awake, restless and bored. She sat at the breakfast table, lazily stirring her hot chocolate with a silver spoon, an expression of mild discontent on her young face. Mabel moved efficiently around the room, setting down fresh pastries and refilling Nicholas's coffee. Lily's gaze followed her movements, her lips pursing slightly. Then, out of nowhere, she let out an exaggerated sigh. "Why do we still have such an old servant here?" she asked loudly, her small voice carrying an unmistakable sharpness. The words cut through the room, a momentary silence falling over the table. Nicholas set down his coffee cup, his grip tightening ever so slightly. Across from him, Isabel didn't even glance up from her plate, as if she hadn't heard. But she had. Mabel, ever composed, simply continued with her duties, though there was the slightest pause before she reached for another dish. "Lily," Nicholas said, his voice measured, "that is not how we speak about people in this house." Lily shrugged, unimpressed by the mild reprimand. "I was just asking. She looks really old. Shouldn't she be retired or something?" Isabel finally looked up, a small smirk playing at her lips. "Sweetheart," she said, her tone light, "Mabel has been with this family for a long time. Some people prefer to keep working rather than just sitting around." Lily considered this for a moment, then gave a small giggle. "Oh, like a pet that won't go away?" Nicholas felt a sharp pang in his chest. He glanced at Mabel, who remained unfazed, simply placing a fresh glass of orange juice in front of him as if nothing had been said. But he knew her too well. He saw the subtle tension in her shoulders. Across the table, James stirred his coffee slowly, watching with interest. Marion, however, said nothing. She only gave Nicholas a look, one that spoke volumes. He should say something more. But he didn't. Lily, emboldened by the lack of true consequence, continued her small cruelties throughout the day. When Mabel walked past her in the hallway carrying a tray of linens, Lily deliberately stuck out her foot at the last second. The tray nearly tipped from Mabel's grasp, but she caught it just in time, adjusting herself with quiet dignity. Lily let out a small, mocking laugh before skipping off. At dinner, when Mabel leaned over to pour water into Isabel's glass, Lily scrunched her nose and whispered loudly, "Ew, Mom, I think she touched the rim. Can I get a new one?" Nicholas clenched his jaw, his gaze flicking to Mabel, whose face remained carefully neutral. Isabel smiled faintly, swirling her wine before taking a sip. "Of course, sweetheart," she said, not even looking at Mabel as she reached for another glass. The small acts of humiliation continued. Lily would spill things on purpose, then innocently insist that Mabel clean it up. She would leave her shoes in the middle of the hallway and act offended when Mabel asked her to pick them up. One afternoon, she deliberately knocked over a vase, sending shattered porcelain across the floor. "Oh no," Lily gasped dramatically. "What a mess. Guess someone will have to clean it up." Nicholas, passing by, stopped in his tracks. He stared at his stepdaughter, who looked up at him with wide, feigned innocence. "Lily," he said carefully, "was that on purpose?" Lily pouted. "Of course not. Why would I do that?" From the corner of his eye, he saw Isabel, leaning against the doorway with her arms crossed. Her expression was unreadable, but the slightest twitch at the corner of her lips betrayed amusement. Nicholas exhaled slowly, turning to Mabel. "Mabel, don't worry about this. It's all right, sir," Mabel interrupted, already kneeling down to gather the shards. Nicholas hesitated. He wanted to insist, but Mabel's quiet patience made it difficult. She had always been this way, resilient, unshakable. She had endured far worse in her life, and this was nothing in comparison. But it wasn't nothing. Later that night, when Nicholas sat alone in the drawing room, James entered, a slow smirk on his lips. He poured himself a drink, settling into a chair across from his brother. "So," James said, swirling his whiskey, "you're just gonna let that little demon get away with it?" Nicholas sighed, rubbing his temples. "She's just a child, James." James scoffed. "That's not just a child. That's a spoiled, mean-spirited brat who knows exactly what she's doing. And your wife, well, She's not exactly discouraging it, is she?" Nicholas didn't answer. James leaned forward, his smirk fading. "You know, I never thought I'd see the day when you, Nicholas Dio, of all people, would just sit back and let someone humiliate Mabel, the woman who raised you." Nicholas's chest tightened. "I'm not letting it happen." "Aren't you?" James arched an eyebrow. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like silence's permission." Nicholas had no response to that. The following morning, breakfast was quiet. Mabel moved efficiently around the table as always, her hands steady, her expression unreadable. Then, without warning, Lily reached for her juice, made a small oops noise, and deliberately knocked the glass over. The vibrant orange liquid splattered across the table and straight onto Mabel's apron. The silence was deafening. Mabel took a step back, looking down at the stain. Lily gasped dramatically. "Oh no, Mabel, you really should be more careful." Nicholas stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "Lily," his voice was sharp this time, "that was on purpose." Lily looked up, feigning innocence. "It was an accident," she insisted. "Right, Mommy?" Isabel, sipping her coffee, smiled faintly. "Of course, darling, accidents happen." Mabel, already reaching for a napkin, simply shook her head slightly, as if she had expected nothing else. Nicholas felt a sickening weight settle in his stomach. He should say something. He should stop this. But he hesitated. And in that hesitation, Lily smiled. It was the smallest thing, a barely perceptible curl of her lips. But it was enough. James, watching from across the room, exhaled slowly. "Huh?" he muttered under his breath. "So, this is the man you are now?" Nicholas clenched his fists at his sides. He didn't answer, because deep down, he wasn't sure if he knew any more. The Deo estate was bathed in the soft glow of the evening as guests arrived in sleek black cars, the rhythmic crunch of tires against gravel echoing through the grand entrance. The air hummed with polite conversation, laughter drifting through the open doors of the ballroom as waiters weaved between elegantly dressed attendees, offering glasses of champagne. It was Isabel's grand introduction, the night she had been waiting for since the moment she married into the Dio name. The guest list was carefully curated. Business moguls, socialites, politicians, all people Isabel considered worthy of her company. Nicholas, standing near the bar, held a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. He observed his wife from a distance as she worked the room with effortless grace, her laughter light, her smiles practiced to perfection. It should have felt like a celebration, but something about the night felt off, a tension simmering beneath the surface that he couldn't quite shake. Lily flitted around in a dress of pale gold, an image of innocence to the untrained eye. But Nicholas knew better. She had spent the day terrorizing Mabel in her usual quiet ways. Spilled drinks, misplaced belongings, sharp words masked as innocence. Each time, Mabel had endured it with the same unwavering patience, but Nicholas had seen the exhaustion creeping into her eyes. He had done nothing. The thought sat heavy in his chest, a weight that only grew heavier as the evening unfolded. Then it happened. He hadn't seen how it started, whether it was planned or if it was just another one of Lily's cruel impulses. All he knew was that one moment, Mabel was passing through the ballroom with a tray, moving discreetly through the glittering crowd as she always did, and the next, Lily was standing in her path, her small hands gripping the edges of Mabel's apron. There was a sharp tug. A collective gasp rippled through the room as Mabel stumbled slightly, the fabric pulling loose from her waist. The tray in her hands wobbled dangerously, glasses clinking together, but she managed to keep her balance. The moment stretched unbearably long, the silence thick and suffocating as all eyes turned toward them. And then Lily giggled. It was light, deliberate, and cruel. "Why are you still wearing this?" Lily asked, her voice high and sweet, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I mean, do you even need it? You're just a really old maid." The words sliced through the air, and this time there was no pretending it was an accident. Nicholas's breath caught in his throat. He barely registered the murmurs spreading through the crowd, the awkward shifting of guests, the way James, standing just feet away, exhaled sharply, shaking his head in what looked like disgust. He saw Mabel freeze, her hands tightening around the tray, her expression as composed as ever. But Nicholas knew. He knew that this was different, and he saw Isabel smiling. It was subtle, just the faintest curve of her lips as she sipped from her champagne glass, watching. Mabel's hands shook just slightly before she carefully set down the tray on a nearby table. Then she bent down and retrieved her apron from where it hung limply in Lily's hands. She didn't snatch it, didn't react with anger. Instead, she folded it precisely, smoothing the fabric with slow, practiced motions, the kind of movements of someone who had endured too much for too long. She straightened, looking at Lily with nothing but quiet dignity. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said softly. Then she turned, stepping away from the scene as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. And Nicholas felt every second of his silence suffocate him. His body moved before his mind caught up, his steps carrying him toward the center of the room, toward the lingering tension left in Mabel's wake. His voice, when he spoke, came out sharp and commanding, cutting through the murmurs. Enough. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The weight of it stopped everything. Conversations died. The music, which had been nothing more than a soft background hum, felt deafening in contrast to the stillness that followed. Lily blinked up at him wide-eyed, her small hands still clinging to the apron. For the first time, she looked unsure. Nicholas turned his gaze to Isabel. She was watching him with something curious, as if she were waiting to see what he would do next. His grip on his glass tightened. "This," he said, his voice steady but lethal, "is my home." His gaze swept across the room, making sure every guest was watching, listening. "And if anyone thinks they can come in here and treat my family like this, they can leave. Now." There was a beat of silence. Then Isabel's lips parted in a soft, mocking breath of laughter. "Oh, Nicholas," she mused, swirling her champagne, "you're making a scene." The words barely registered. His attention was solely on Lily now, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. "Apologize," he said, each syllable carefully measured. Lily hesitated, then she pouted. "But I didn't. Apologize, now." Her lips trembled. For a second, she looked toward Isabel, expecting rescue. Isabel only took another sip of her drink. Lily's face twisted in anger. "I'm sorry," she mumbled. Nicholas exhaled sharply, turning away from her. His hands were shaking. He ran a hand through his hair, forcing himself to take a breath. The sickening weight in his chest refused to lift. James stepped closer, voice low. "Little late, isn't it?" Nicholas couldn't argue. He turned, searching for Mabel, but she was already gone. The rest of the evening was a blur. The party continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Guests whispered, awkwardly filling the silence that Nicholas's outburst had left behind. Isabel carried on as if nothing had happened, playing the perfect hostess, but Nicholas saw the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. And Lily Lily sulked in the corner of the room, the first time she had ever truly been reprimanded. Hours later, when the estate had fallen into quiet, Nicholas made his way to Mabel's quarters. He hesitated at the door, then knocked. Silence. A long moment passed before the door creaked open. Mabel stood there, still in her uniform, but with her coat draped over her arm. She had packed a bag. Nicholas's throat went dry. "Mabel," he started, voice raw, but she lifted a hand before he could continue. "My boy," she said, her voice gentle. "I stayed as long as I was needed." Nicholas swallowed against a sharp ache in his chest. "You're still needed." Mabel studied him. Then, slowly, she shook her head. "I don't think I am." The words gutted him. His silence had cost him the only real family he had ever known, and now he was too late to fix it. Nicholas stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, his breath uneven, his heart hammering against his ribs as he stared at Mabel's packed bag. The weight of his silence, the weeks of turning away, of pretending that things weren't as bad as they were, crashed down on him like a suffocating tide. She was really leaving. The woman who had raised him, the one constant in his life, the one who had been more of a mother than his own mother ever was walking away. His throat was dry. "Mabel," he tried again, softer this time, stepping forward as if closing the distance could somehow fix the damage he had done. She stood tall, dignified, the same way she had always carried herself, but there was something different now, something final in the way she held herself, in the way her fingers curled ever so slightly around the handle of her small, worn suitcase. "I know what you're going to say," she murmured, her voice calm but firm, "and you don't need to say it, my boy." Nicholas swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "Then let me say something else. Don't go." She exhaled slowly, as if she had expected this plea. She lifted her eyes to his, and he saw something deep within them. It wasn't anger. It wasn't resentment. It was disappointment. "Nicholas," she said gently, "you let them humiliate me, and you stood there. You watched, over and over again." His chest tightened, a sharp, twisting pain lacing through him because he couldn't deny it. He had let it happen. He had seen the small cruelties, the sharp words disguised as innocence, the way Lily had made a game of degrading her. And Isabel. She had encouraged it, watching with detached amusement as if Mabel were nothing more than an old relic in the way of the future she had planned for herself. Mabel shook her head, her voice steady. "I knew that child was cruel the moment she stepped foot in this house, and I knew her mother wouldn't stop her. But you," her voice softened, but the words hit harder, "you were supposed to be better than them." Nicholas clenched his fists, shame washing over him like a burning wave. "I should have stopped it," he admitted, his voice raw. "I should have spoken up the first time. I should have." "But you didn't," Mabel interrupted, her voice gentle but unyielding, "and that hurt more than anything they ever did to me." The words knocked the air from his lungs. He had never heard her sound so tired before. Not even when she had stayed up with him all night as a child, tending to his fevers, or when she had comforted him through the hardest moments of his life. She had always been strong, always unshaken, but now she looked at him as though he had failed her in a way that couldn't be undone. She adjusted her coat over her arm, glancing toward the door. "It's time for me to go, Nicholas." His body reacted before his mind did. His hand reached out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist, not tightly, not in force, but in a silent plea. "You don't have to," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Please." Mabel's lips pressed together for a long moment before she placed her free hand over his, her warmth familiar, grounding, like it always had been. But this time, it wasn't comforting. It was goodbye. "My boy," she said, and her voice was softer now, like she was speaking to him the way she had when he was small, when he had needed her most. "I love you. I always will." His grip loosened. She pulled away, and then she was walking past him, her small, deliberate steps echoing against the wooden floors as she made her way toward the door. Nicholas turned, watching helplessly, every part of him screaming to stop her, to fix this, to make it right. But he didn't know how. She reached for the handle, pausing just long enough to glance over her shoulder. "I hope one day you find the courage to be the man I know you can be." And then she was gone. The heavy creak of the door, the rush of the night air, the slow, deliberate closing that sealed his failure behind her. Nicholas stood in the empty hallway, his pulse pounding in his ears, the weight in his chest suffocating. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked too loudly, marking the seconds that stretched endlessly as he stared at the space she had just occupied. A deep, sharp ache settled into his bones. He had let her walk away, and he had no one to blame but himself. Nicholas stood at the estate's entrance, the morning air cool against his skin, his breath forming faint wisps in the dawn light. The house was silent in a way it had never been before, as if the very walls sensed the absence of the woman who had kept it whole. Mabel was gone. He had let her leave. The weight of his failure clung to him like a second skin, suffocating, unbearable. He had spent the night unable to sleep, his mind replaying every moment he had let pass in silence, every chance he had to stop the cruelty but chose not to act. And now, all that was left was an empty space where she used to be. Isabel had noticed his mood. When he finally returned to their bedroom, she was seated at the vanity, running a brush through her golden hair with calculated ease. She hadn't asked about Mabel, hadn't even acknowledged that she had left. But as Nicholas stepped inside, she met his reflection in the mirror, a knowing smirk curving at her lips. "I was wondering when you'd finally come to your senses," she said lightly. "She should have been gone a long time ago." Nicholas had felt something deep inside him fracture at her words. Now, standing in the cold morning air, he realized something with absolute certainty. He could not let this stand. He could not let Mabel walk away believing he had chosen them over her. He needed to bring her home. He didn't take the car. He needed to walk, to feel the distance between him and the person he had been just yesterday, the man who had hesitated for too long. The estate's long gravel driveway stretched before him, leading out to the main road. He had walked this path 1,000 times as a boy, chasing after summer breezes, Mabel's voice calling him back to the house for dinner. Now, every step felt heavier than the last. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, the morning had settled into a quiet rhythm. The scent of fresh bread drifted from the bakery, the distant chatter of merchants setting up for the day filling the air, but none of it mattered. He kept moving, his steps purposeful, his pulse hammering in his ears. Mabel's cottage was small, tucked away behind a garden that had grown wild over the years. It was a humble home, but Nicholas knew it was hers, a place that belonged entirely to her, something the estate had never truly been. He hesitated at the gate. For the first time in years, he felt nervous. Taking a breath, he knocked. There was a long pause. Then the door creaked open. Mabel stood there, dressed simply, her silver-streaked hair pulled back, her gaze steady as she took him in. She didn't look surprised to see him. If anything, she looked like she had been expecting this. Nicholas swallowed hard. "May I come in?" Mabel studied him for a moment before stepping aside. The inside of the cottage was warm, familiar, the scent of lavender lingering in the air. He had been here before as a child, sneaking away from the estate to sit by the fire while Mabel told him stories that made the world feel smaller, safer. Now, the warmth of the room felt like a reminder of everything he had let slip through his fingers. She moved to the kitchen, pouring tea into 2 cups, setting them on the wooden table with the same practiced ease she had shown in the estate's grand dining hall. She took her seat, gesturing for him to do the same. He sat, his hands clasped together, the silence stretching between them. "I let you down," he said finally, his voice low but steady. Mabel's gaze didn't waver. "For weeks," he continued, "I let you be treated like you were nothing, and I did nothing to stop it." Mabel was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed, setting her cup down with a careful precision. "You were always a good boy, Nicholas," she said softly, "but sometimes even good boys lose their way." Nicholas swallowed hard. "I was afraid," he admitted, his voice raw, "afraid to confront Isabel, afraid to create a bigger divide. I kept telling myself I could fix it later, that I would handle it in time." Mabel nodded slowly, as if she had already known the answer. "And now?" she asked gently. Nicholas exhaled. "Now I know that losing you would be far worse than anything else." For the first time, something in Mabel's expression softened. She let out a small, weary sigh, her fingers wrapping around her cup. "I should have left a long time ago," she admitted, "but I didn't. Because despite everything, that house was my home." Nicholas leaned forward, his jaw tight. "Then come home." Mabel hesitated. She reached for her cup, fingers tightening slightly around the porcelain, but she didn't drink. "You don't need me there anymore," she said after a moment. "You're a grown man, Nicholas." Nicholas shook his head. "That's not true. You were never just someone who looked after me. You're my family, and family belongs together." Mabel's fingers tensed slightly. Nicholas took a slow breath. "If you still want to leave," he said, his voice quieter now, "if you decide you don't want to come back, I'll understand. But I needed to tell you this. I needed you to hear it." The silence stretched between them again, heavy but not suffocating. Then, slowly, Mabel sighed. She set her cup down, meeting his gaze with something warmer than before. "Finish your tea," she murmured. "Then we'll see." Relief flooded through Nicholas, but he didn't rush to celebrate. He simply nodded, lifting his cup, savoring the warmth, the familiarity, the quiet understanding that filled the room. When they left the cottage together later that morning, the road back to the estate didn't seem quite as long. The house was waiting, and this time it would feel whole again. What happened changed everything. Justice was served, but at what cost? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story.